It's Sunday, August 11, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a Democratic strategist and senior advisor to TargetSmart, a Democratic data, analytics, and polling firm. Tom Bonier, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
It's great to be here.
It's an interesting time for polling. I want to talk about kind of methodology and have people kind of understand where these numbers come from. But of course, we should address the fact that Kamala Harris continues to gain strength in the U.S. presidential election, in polls nationally, in battleground states, now show her building leads or at least catching Donald Trump. And on Friday morning, 5:38, their analysis put Harris up by 2.1 points over her Republican rival in its national average. Just talk to us about this with the benefit of your experience, because, you know, I spend a lot of time saying, ignore the polls, partly because of the methodology being a little old-fashioned in some cases, but maybe you can kind of clear that up. Is it true that it's like landlines, often the case, phoning old-fashioned telephones, house phones, and invariably older people have house phones? Let's just deal with that first, shall we?
It can be, and I'm not quite there with you. You know, there are times where I say ignore the polls, but in reality, what people should do is what we're getting into now, which is just be a smarter consumer of the polls. There's a lot of bad polls out there. So to your question, yeah, the polls that are not the more reliable polls are still just polling the same way they did, believe it or not, 10, 20, 30, even 40 years ago, where they're calling mostly just phones. There are very few pollsters now who are just calling landline phones. I don't know that many people who actually still have landlines. I have one in a kitchen cabinet that I don't think I've ever heard ring. But the better polls are doing what we call multimodal data collection, which is a fancy way of saying they're collecting data a whole bunch of different ways. They're getting people where they are, understanding that, yeah, for older voters, it's easier to get them on a landline. But for younger voters, that's not going to work. And in fact, not surprisingly, younger voters are the hardest people to reach. You know, we look at them and we say, well, cell phones, right? I teach college students. I taught courses at Howard University. I always ask the students, how many of you answer your phone if it's an unknown number? Almost no one does. So you have to do different things. You have to do online surveys. You have to do text surveys. There's so many different modes of data collection. And frankly, it's expensive and really time consuming to get it right. It's why most polls, frankly, don't get it right.
Would you say that the current situation where it's obviously it's a two-horse race, although I see that RFK Jr. seems to be polling around 10% in some places, which to me seems quite remarkable. And in fact, some very kind of high-profile podcasters, I shall name no names, have actually switched their allegiance from Donald Trump to RFK Jr. in the last few days. I don't know how that will change things, but it is so surprising to me that, considering that Donald Trump is this threat to democracy, clearly an authoritarian, clearly aligned with Russia rather than America, clearly in the tank for, you know, all the wrong aspects of America, you know, corporate America, and those who really have made life difficult for regular people, that he is still polling so well. And it just doesn't make sense. Is that because I'm living in some kind of liberal bubble, or is it a genuine reflection of the fact that people have looked at Donald Trump, despite his horrific 4 years in office, despite all the lies, despite all the, you know, the being a convicted felon, of course, and are like, yeah, that's my guy?
It's hard to believe. I'm with you on that. You know, I think we have to go back to the beginning of this sort of the MAGA party that Donald Trump launched, and he went down that escalator at his absurd campaign launch back in 2015. And we have to keep in mind, his party has truly failed in many ways every election since it existed. 2016 was the one where he sort of snuck in on us. One, people believed he was much more moderate than he actually turned out being. The exit polls and the polls around the election showed us that, right? And even at the same time, he lost by a very significant national margin. majority of Americans voted against his candidacy. In the 2018 elections, Democrats won in a blue wave, repudiating Trump's vision for America. In 2020, quite famously, he lost. In 2022, what should have been a red wave election, given all of the historic indicators, all of the historic precedent, Republicans generally failed. Yes, they did take back the House by the most narrow margins, but they lost a lot of races that they were expected to win. And so here we are in 2024, and I think a lot of us have the same question you have, which is, how is this even close? Well, there is a plausible world where we wake up the morning after the election and it wasn't close. What we're seeing happening in the polls right now could be the beginning of some of that sense and rationality returning to American politics and building upon what we've seen in these prior elections. We don't know. Of course, the potential consequences of assuming that is going to happen are so dire that I hesitate to even utter those words. And yes, the fact that any polls show this race to be close at all, it's hard to believe. And that's a whole different conversation, one that you've covered quite well over this time period. But in the end, you know, the media is to bear a lot of that blame in terms of how they have normalized him. We saw that last week in his press conference where he really didn't face any true tough questioning, and a lot of the issues that should have been brought up were not. And they won a horse race. And then, you know, of course, he has manipulated a large segment of America to follow him and to vote for him. And you know, that's something that we can't forget. But again, when we see most of the polling, the challenge for the Trump campaign is they have a hard time breaking the low to mid 40s in the polling in most polls. He hasn't proven himself capable of really exceeding that in any of these elections. So that's the question for his campaign, is how do they get voters who weren't with him in 2020, they weren't with him in 2016, to come out and vote for him in 2024? That's a tough question for them to answer. I don't believe they've provided a plausible case for yet.
I keep trying to remind people, Tom, that he hasn't won anything since 2016. And the analysis of the 2016 election, of course, he lost the popular vote in 2016. But the Russian meddling, James Comey's speech a week or so before about Hillary Clinton's emails a week or so before the vote, and various other kind of social media propaganda was the reason that he won. And also he was untested at that point. People didn't really know, as you alluded to, quite how extreme his presidency was going to be. And I remind people of what his presidency was like. I think people have short memories, you know, that huge fence up around the White House, the streets boarded up, stores boarded up, and the National Guard on the street, and protests all the time. I mean, you know, that was the reality of the Trump presidency. But my fear this time is that he has been telling us now for the last 8 years how popular he is, how successful he was, how huge his crowd sizes were. The fact that none of it is true is kind of irrelevant, because he is platformed by the corporate media, as you said, and, you know, they've not done their due diligence. So all that's left is him on a stage telling people what they think they want to hear, and no one is questioning that. So is that the reason that people believe this stuff? They don't need to dig, because if he's telling them, then it must be true.
You know, I think a lot of this is the timing and the year of which he has emerged, and he's a product of his own making in a lot of ways. Obviously, when he came into the national political scene through the racist birther movement, and as society makes progress, when we've seen, you know, marriage equality over a decade ago come into effect, we're making progress, obviously not quickly enough, but there's a whole segment of Americans who feel marginalized. They feel like they are being left behind because they do hold on to some racist beliefs or otherwise bigoted beliefs. And for him to come along and tell people, no, you're right, we're right, they're wrong, and then to wrap it up in some faux populism, it's what he's been able to ride to this level of authority. Again, thankfully, there are not enough Americans to account for a majority. But given the way that our system works, given the bias of the Electoral College, given the gerrymandering in the House, the natural constitutional gerrymander of the United States Senate, he's been able to get too far, frankly. And so, yes, I think, it's a huge element of this. He has this death grip on the Republican Party. The primary system, the closed primary system, is a big part of this as well, right? That he has Republicans who we know would oppose him, including now his vice president, his vice presidential nominee, who opposed him. And, Republicans know that either they fall in line with him or they risk losing their ascension to power. And so almost universally, Republican elected officials have chosen power over democracy. I don't want to sell short. There are many patriots who abandoned the Republican Party and created their own movement to oppose him, and that has been important. But those left standing, obviously, have traded in any credibility for the hope of getting some power within a second Trump administration.
I want to talk about racism for a moment because you brought it up. And, that is the tragedy of this whole American story, isn't it? That racism is ever present in pretty much every decade. And despite the civil rights movement, it never went away, to the extent that, we have a modern version of lynchings now. We saw that with Ahmaud Arbery being murdered in the street. We see it with police officers, only recently shooting an innocent black woman in the face and killing her in her own home. This is the worst part of America. And yet, as you say, there does seem to be still a leftover from history number of Americans who would vote for this. And if Donald Trump represents this, and to me, it feels like he does, then that is the person that they feel represents them. Is any polling ever done, taking politics to one side and actually polling racist Americans? Because I never really know what I'm talking about in terms of numbers. We always say, maybe a third of Americans support Trump, and then maybe half of those are a little bit racist. I mean, can you kind of talk to the demographics of racist America? Because that's going to play a huge part in this race, because we have another black candidate running for office in Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it's, as you would expect, complicated. There is polling on this. In the end, obviously, you can't just ask people outright. Well, you could ask them outright if they're racist. And actually, many of these people might tell you yes, but for the most part, you won't get an honest answer. But what they do is they will ask questions that have become, these popular. The term dog whistle isn't even appropriate anymore, because the dog whistle is silent, and this is so much more prominent. But, the best example in this moment that I can think of is this anti-DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. We've seen this with J.D. Vance being very much out in front of this, constantly talking about it and referring to the vice president, Kamala Harris, someone with infinitely more experience and credentials than he himself has, or frankly, Donald Trump has, referring to her as a DEI vice president. And so you can poll on issues like that in terms of opinion on DEI. And it's not to say that everyone who has perhaps some sort of conflicted view on it is an unmitigated racist, but there's some element, right? That there's someone who has been manipulated, who is digesting that information, and it is finding it appealing. And again, it goes back to what I said a moment ago. It's people who frankly feel marginalized and frightened, not to apologize for them in any way, but they fear losing power, losing what they have. It's this false sense of scarcity, which is in the end the opposite of what this country was founded on, at least at our best. And so yes, you do see in that polling, and it's often frightening what you'll see in terms of the percent of Americans. You mentioned, maybe a third, and a half. Some of these different indicators of racism, you'll see more than a third. Again, not in the most dramatic sense, but when it comes to issues like DEI, where Republicans and Donald Trump especially have manipulated the American public, you see, and sometimes approaching 40% who are agreeing with them, which is, troubling, to put it mildly.
Tim Walz, who is the new VP pick alongside Kamala Harris, made a very good point about rights. And he said that, it's not like there's a pie and people's rights, there's only so many rights to go round. Rights are infinite. You can, everybody can have their rights addressed or given back their rights or given access to rights. There's no limit on it. And I think that really is an issue for how a lot of American people have been sold this idea that, in terms of the changing demographic, as you talk about, this fear of the great replacement theory, that America is changing from a white nation to a black or brown nation. It wasn't really a white nation to start with. Always conveniently forget that section, don't they? But I mean, this is really the elephant in the room, isn't it? And we've heard Tucker Carlson, when he used to be on Fox, talking about the great replacement theory and, white replacement. We've heard Donald Trump talking about eugenics, and even was quoted recently at a rally saying, I think you'd rather have a white president, wouldn't you, to deal with these issues? I mean, it is overt. The racism is overt. It's so childish, so offensive, but it's also so out of step with how the rest of the world has moved on. And part of the problem of being, isolationist is that you don't realize that this stuff is ancient history in many other countries.
Well, and I laugh at this only because it's almost maddening. But you mentioned President Trump. Elon Musk is on that list as someone who has promoted the great replacement theory in terms of immigration, and that it's this notion that they obviously don't believe, because they're smart enough to know the facts, that Democrats are not allowing immigrants to come to the country to create votes. And in fact, Donald Trump is quite proudly talking about how he actually performs much better with Latino voters. And so there's not even an argument to be made there on the numbers, let alone the reality that these immigrants are not able to vote. But I think about J.D. Vance and a comment he made a few weeks ago about his wife, a woman of color, where he noted that she is a woman of color, and then went on to say good things about her. And so it's throughout the Republican Party. Again, they're in a lot of ways it's more cynical, right? Because I don't believe that most of these leaders within the Republican Party, these Trumpists, believe the things they're saying.
Right.
But they know that it's an effective form of manipulating people to come out and vote for them. And in the end, they know, as we were talking about earlier, the math doesn't add up for them. They lost the last election. As you said, they also lost the popular vote in 2016 when they were able to fool enough people in the battleground states into believing they were moderate.
And there was no red wave at the midterms either.
Right. And so they know they need to be able to mobilize people who weren't part of the process to come out and vote. They need to scare enough people. And so that's where these lies come from. The closer we get to election day, you're going to see more of this fear campaign. The word caravans, right? When it comes to immigrants coming, you don't hear about these caravans of migrants coming to the border until generally the last 4 to 8 weeks of a political campaign. The rest of the 2-year cycle, amazingly, they don't exist. Now, in reality, it's not anything new, but the media is complicit, where they will take these Republican talking points and they will trumpet them, and they are entirely racist talking points that are intended to strike fear into the hearts. We saw that in 2020. Obviously, the combination of the pandemic and then the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement emerging, and the Republicans using that to try to manipulate voters into voting out of fear, saying that what is happening in these cities, looking at these demonstrations, frankly, using fake footage in a lot of instances,
yes,
and saying this is what will happen. Now, obviously, we've had almost 4 years of a Biden presidency, and amazingly, the cities of America have not burned to the grounds, nor have the suburbs, exurbs, or rural communities where most of these voters who were targeted with this fear campaign live. So I think it becomes more challenging for Republicans that, well, no, this time it'll really happen. We saw this with J.D. Vance saying, it was Miller, the president, Stephen Miller, the former advisor, I guess current advisor, who said that the Harris-Walz ticket would turn the Midwest into Mogadishu.
Yeah.
Incredibly racist. And again, a fear campaign with no rational thought or notion of policy behind it. We're only going to see more of that as we get closer to Election Day, because they don't have any specific policies at this point that are popular. And I don't, having worked in politics for almost 30 years now, we haven't had a campaign like this before. I think back to the presidential debate several weeks ago. It was breathtaking that Donald Trump didn't really promote any specific policy other than deportation. Again, a fear-based policy. So
mass deportations, I think it was.
Yes, mass deportations.
Yeah. The Republicans, though, have never really run on policy, have they? It's more about kind of bringing down Democratic policy and trying to, we're going to eradicate that, or we're going to shut that down, or because, their language is of deregulation and all that stuff, which, we've learned that trickle-down economics is also a kind of fake right-wing methodology that was only created to kind of give the impression that the people will do better if you give tax breaks to the rich. I'm hoping that people have kind of worked that out now. But is there not going to be, at some point in this campaign between now and November, a point at which voters, independents, even some conservatives say to themselves, well, hang on a second, all this stuff that Donald Trump is telling us, and in the press conference that you mentioned that he did at Mar-a-Lago, he said it's going to be World War III, that the country is a nation in decline, that you are going to see a Great Depression like of 1929, using the most extreme examples, because he's on the ropes, I guess. When people kind of look around, America isn't that. America is actually doing really rather well, especially on the world stage.
He's relying on anger to trump joy, or even just a sense of a desire to return to some sense of normalcy, right? As has been said before, make politics boring again. I think that's what a lot of people want. And so you're right. 8 years ago, certainly 4 years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, and again, obviously he didn't even win in this context, there was more anger. There was more unrest. Things have changed. The economy has improved faster than any of the global economies. Things are generally good in this country. Are they perfect? No. Is there still pain out there? Yes, as there always has been. But the reality is things are getting better, and they're getting better here faster than they are anywhere else. And so for them to rely on people who are angry to come out and fuel a victory, there are just fewer of them. And as you mentioned earlier, you then also have to factor in everything that happened since the last time he ran, the most important of which is January 6th. I'll say that's the most important, and maybe the second most important is the fact that he is now a convicted felon.
Yeah.
That those two elements, that didn't win him any votes. And I will tell you, it's just a slight digression, but this is important, and this is information we haven't shared publicly, but it's incredibly telling. We've seen the Trump campaign run a very cynical effort after his conviction, and this continues, to suggest that him being a convicted felon would make him more relatable to African-American voters.
Yeah, insane.
Absurd and racist on its surface.
Yeah.
Well, we, over the last few weeks, have been conducting focus groups with African-American voters. Two things I want to share from that I think are telling. And again, sharing this here for the first time, but in the context of this, it's important. One, this is not something we asked about. It came up organically among the groups of the participants talking about his conviction. And it was not, with any of them, a sense of relatability or that they liked him more. It was a sense, honestly, of outrage. One participant said that they aren't able to get a job at UPS with a criminal record. How is Donald Trump able to run for president still? It's a sense of white privilege on display, and it's not something that in any ways is appealing to anyone. The second element of this, speaking of the transition at the top of the ticket over the last 3 weeks, one of the focus groups was a group of African-American Trump supporters, which was a harder group to recruit. But we know that, generally about 1 in 10 African-American voters will vote Republican in any given election. The changeover and candidacy happened in the midst of this. We had recruited the group, but we hadn't gone forward with the group yet. After the changeover happened, we had 3 participants reach out and say that they no longer wanted to participate in the group because they would be supporting the vice president. So, the good news and the positive news here is a lot of this cynical, racist campaigning that Donald Trump is putting out there, it's not working. And in fact, all indicators are that it's backfiring.
And it's so interesting that there was so much of a backlash towards the birther issue with Obama and Trump. And yet here we are again with doing more birther stuff. Like, he didn't think, oh, well, that probably wasn't a good idea back then. Now he's going on stage at the Association of Black Journalists and is going, is she black or is she Asian? And then he's like, well, I don't care, but she should. This weird projection to give the impression that she is in some way being dishonest about her own heritage, not understanding about how people of color identify, and just being completely vapid on the subject of race and heritage and culture. And that in itself should, I'm hoping, with that I was thinking, how can any black person vote for Donald Trump, considering that was the announcement that he made only this week? I mean, 1949 maybe, but not in 2024.
Interestingly, the last of our focus groups, of the 4 focus groups we conducted, was it was the evening of that day where he made that NABJ appearance. And you sometimes wonder with these things, for those of us who are in the bubble that you mentioned earlier, those of us who are very online and are always on Twitter and elsewhere and consuming every bit of news, which probably isn't the best thing for our mental health, but you wonder how much of that actually trickles out to the average American, especially given that our media is so generally ill-equipped to cover these things and that they do what they can to normalize Donald Trump. And what we found in this focus group is that not only were they aware of it, but they were outraged by it. So these things are being noticed. He is who he is to a certain extent, which is who he was over 10 years ago when he was one of the leaders of the birther movement. And so, I think he benefited in this campaign. And I think one of the reasons why the polls, frankly, he was polling better earlier in this cycle was just because he was benefiting from kind of being in the background. And we do have short memories, and we can be a forgiving people. And in the end, we have this tendency to just want things to be normal. We want normal political leaders who are going to be boring, who we don't have to worry about what they're talking about because they're just out there doing the mundane work of the people to make our lives easy and better. And so when you have to deal with things like this, it just gets exhausting. And that was really the sense we were getting in these focus groups, is this sense of exhaustion of, are we really doing this again? And
that's
I think
how I
that's
feel.
I think
about you.
It's maybe the most commonly held perception in American politics today.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, I always say politics should be boring, but it should be administrative. That is what politics is. It's administering the economy, public services, international relations. It should be boring, efficient, and, done in a that's the civil service all over. And yet here it really is like an extension of the Celebrity Apprentice reality show, a personality contest where, who can go lower with their critique. And that's the saddest part of it. I mean, the fact that we've been hearing from J.D. Vance criticizing Tim Walz's military record. I mean, I couldn't believe that, Tim Walz in the military for 25 years. J.D. Vance, who sat in an office in Baghdad writing press releases for 4 years, is criticizing Tim Walz's record and using that as political collateral. Like, that is not normal. It should not be normal to talk in that way. And yet here in the US, with the support of the corporate media, that kind of rhetoric is normalized.
Well, and to me, it's just a sign of a losing campaign in the end, that they can't find an issue that they can talk about that is a winning issue. And you talk about the the sort of boring administrative work of our government. It's the Biden Harris presidency has been one of the most successful presidencies in the history of this country, and I'm confident the history books will show that when you look at the caps on insulin prices, the infrastructure, the environmental progress, and to do it with a completely obstructionist Republican Party in Congress is remarkable. But back to J.D. Vance, to him and other Republicans attacking Tim Walz's military record, it shows that they don't have it. This is a tired attack that they brought out 20 years ago against John Kerry. It might have been effective then because Democrats and liberals were always afraid to fire back and to attack. And that's not Tim Walz. Tim Walz has made J.D. Vance look foolish, and he knows it. He's obviously been hurting from it. And so they're just resorting to political stunts now. We saw last week J.D. Vance stalking the campaign and showing up at the airport in this very entitled way. I don't know what voter who isn't currently or wasn't before voting for Trump and Vance seeing that stunt and saying, oh, that's what I want. I want more of that in my life. And then again, when you compare it to this wonderful combination of a great set of accomplishments that the vice president can talk about, a great agenda going forward, and frankly, just, as Tim Walz said in that rollout in Philadelphia last week, a joyful campaign. I think people want some joy in
bringing
their lives.
the joy back. Yeah, it's so true. It's often about a feeling. It's not just a manifesto pledge or policy. It's a feeling, and I think that's the biggest shift in the last week or two.
I think that's incredibly important. Those of us who work in political data analysis, we kind of joke about, people talk about, quote, vibes, right?
Yeah.
Which is really what you're talking about. It's the feeling. And in this case, it's actually incredibly important and relevant. And I actually think there's a lesson to be learned here politically, because if we think back to just a month ago when there were these conversations going on about, should President Biden step aside? Should Vice President Harris be the nominee? Should there be a primary process? And we were all microanalyzing every poll we could find. And there were a lot of polls. Everyone was testing, well, how does Vice President Harris fare against Trump versus this candidate versus that candidate? And at the time, if you remember, we looked at all those polls and there wasn't that much of a difference. At best, one candidate might be running a point or two ahead of where President Biden was at the time. So a lot of people looked at that and said,
all margin of error.
Right, exactly. It's statistically meaningless. So there was a question at the time, should we be going through this dramatic process so close to the election if this is the only difference? And really what we saw happen was the change happened, and then you saw this immediate outpouring of excitement and enthusiasm for the vice president, and really from the vice president at the same time. And that energy just fed and built upon itself, where you saw younger voters tuning in and being enthusiastic about this election cycle for the first time. You saw voters who weren't engaged tuning in, and then the polls followed it. So we have to remember, the polls are not determinative. They're not even necessarily predictive. They're capturing that one moment in time. And the one lesson from that is polls on sort of conditional elements, they're not very helpful or reliable. To ask someone, well, how would you vote if this happened? Well, people, they generally don't know, or they're going to tell you what they would think would be the case or what should be the case. And in the end, we saw it was really, again, this, quote, vibe shift. And that's what has been the most important change, was this the change in how people are feeling about this. And that's why I think you've seen this campaign over their first few weeks really doing everything they can to keep that going. And, from a timing perspective, as you go into next week in the convention, they have a good opportunity here to really ride through the rest of the month and get into that home stretch of post Labor Day with that continuing to grow. And that has to be their strategy in my mind.
Okay, we have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about the difference between these polls, the ones that Trump cites, for example, which always seem to favor him anyway. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath, and on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you a tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. Optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. So, if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/weekend to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/weekend for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. 10 seconds on the clock. How many things can you name that are always growing? Your relationships, your skills, your customer base? How about businesses on Shopify? When we started podcasting, an online store was the furthest thing from our minds. Now we're selling t-shirts and Midas Touch merch, and it's so easy, all because we use Shopify. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business, from the launch of your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the "did we just hit 1 million orders" stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're delivering daily digests or serving sensational scoops, Shopify will help you sell everywhere. From their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person point-of-sale system, wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading commerce platforms. And sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. And Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds and Rothney's and Brooklinen and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's extensive help resources are there to support your success at every step of the way, because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. That's shopify.com/weekend. We're back on The Weekend Show with Tom Bonier. I'm Anthony Davis. So, different polls for different folks, it seems. I think Trump is a big fan of the Rasmussen poll, always talking about that one, which definitely has a Republican lean. And then the other thing to consider is that people in the main are quite disengaged. We call them low information voters or people who just, don't have time for politics. They're also on the receiving end of pollsters' requests as well, aren't they? So they're being asked to kind of take an interest in a subject that they won't really think about until maybe a week or two before the election. So just talk to us about the different polls and why some are favored by different parties.
Well, a big part of it is methodology, like we talked about at the outset of this conversation, where they all have their different ways of collecting data, and there's no one way that's perfect other than, like I said, the more different modes of collection that you're using, the better off you're going to be, because each mode has its own bias. So let's use several different modes. But you mentioned the Rasmussen poll as a great example of a Republican poll, though even that poll has shown Trump doing significantly worse than he was 3 weeks ago. But you also have, let's think back to 2022. And that election, again, the supposed red wave election. And one of the reasons why most in the media were telling us that a red wave was coming was because there was this flood of polls coming from, in many cases, pollsters I'd never heard of before. I don't think anyone had heard of before, because they didn't exist. Some of them were, again, not to denigrate them, 2 of them were from high school students. that were being included in these 538 averages that fairly consistently showed a much more Republican electorate than ever materialized. The bad news is a lot of those suspects from 2022 are back. They started polling again. And so you have those on one hand, who frankly should not only not be trusted or paid attention to by, the general American electorate who's paying attention to these sorts of things. They shouldn't be included in these polling indicators. You mentioned 538 and the fact that the vice president is now taking a lead in the aggregate of polls. Well, that aggregate of polls includes some of these polls. I have to give 538 credit in that they have eliminated some of these polls, including Rasmussen, from their average because they've gone so far that they violated their standards. There are others who are frankly being smarter about it, if you want to credit them, which I guess I would prefer not to, where they're on the surface abiding by their standards. But they're producing results that are just simply not plausible and not in line with what anyone else has seen. Generally, what we want to pay more attention to are what we call these, quote, gold standard polls. There are much fewer of these than there used to be, partially just because of media budgets. You used to have Boston Globe and Cleveland Plain Dealer. New York Times is still there, but a lot of these newspapers would field fairly reliable, legitimate national surveys, and we had a lot of them. And now New York Times is still there. There are a handful that are still there. Most of them don't exist anymore. They don't have the budgets in media, unfortunately. So we have fewer. And I'll say this as an important caveat. Even with these higher standard polls, they can still be very, very wrong. The hardest part about polling, once you get through this question of how do you collect the data, how do you talk to people, how do you interview people, how do you get them to pick up the phone or answer that text, that's a hard part, but the good pollsters can get through it. Once you do that, you still have this element of what is the electorate going to look like? Who's going to turn out to vote? That's actually not something you can poll effectively. So every pollster, when they create this, what they call likely voter model, they have to make decisions. What percent of the voters are going to be women versus men, younger versus older, black versus white versus Latino versus Asian American, independents versus Democrats versus Republicans, you name it. They have to make some assumptions on turnout for all these groups. And if you get any of that wrong, your poll results are going to be skewed one way or another. And the reality is, every pollster, even the best, will get some of that wrong. Predicting turnout is incredibly difficult. Generally, what they will do is they'll look at previous elections. They'll look at the last presidential election in this case and see what turnout was like. Well, let's remember the last presidential election happened during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Many states conducted their elections entirely by mail. Some didn't. People were frightened to go to the polling places where they had to. It was just a very different dynamic.
But that was what, a 64% turnout last time?
Yes, it was the highest turnout that we had in quite some
Which
time.
Which is pretty sad in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. I certainly the rest of the world would look at that and laugh. We would say that's such a great turnout. But and unfortunately, there are states that made it easier to vote 4 years ago who have since made it harder to vote. States like Texas, Georgia, where they've actually rolled back what were wonderful advances in ballot access.
Yes.
But voter suppression has long been a favorite tool of the Republican Party. So what I would say is with these polls, one of the most important things we can look at is trends, meaning I wouldn't view it as an absolute. If a poll shows that Vice President Harris is winning by 4 points, can we bank that and say she's going to win by 4? Absolutely not. But if the same poll with the same methodology 2 weeks earlier had her winning by 1 point, and then the same poll a month before that had President Biden losing by 3 points, what we can confidently state is that there has been a very positive trend and in favor of Democrats and Vice President Harris. And that's exactly what we have seen over the last few weeks, regardless of the poll.
Let's look at the Ipsos poll that dropped on Thursday this week. It showed Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump 42%, 37%. And that showed her widening her lead since a similar poll in July. That was a Reuters Ipsos survey, which found her up 37% to 34% over Trump. That was a nationwide poll over 2,000 adults, 2,045 adults, conducted between the 2nd and the 7th of August. And it also found 4% of those surveyed backed Robert Kennedy Jr., down from 10% in July. Let's just talk about the Kennedy problem here, because we know that these independent candidates are trouble for the two-horse race, aren't they? And him especially. I know that Trump has offered him, in return for him dropping his candidacy, a place in his administration. I'm kind of thinking that could actually happen, to be honest, because it's the only hope he has of getting any power, I presume. But just talk to us about the RFK Jr. effect, and whether or not this Ipsos poll and this Ipsos Reuters poll are speaking the kind of language that you're talking.
Yeah, what you've seen in that specific poll has been actually duplicated across a number of polls. That's a good poll with a decent track record, and those results generally track with what we're seeing in other quality polls. But that specific phenomena that you mentioned, as you mentioned here, as you mentioned earlier, RFK Jr. was polling fairly reliably in the double digits, between 10 and in some cases upwards of 15% earlier in the race when it was a Biden-Trump horse race. Really what was happening at the time is he was this receptacle, for lack of a better term, for voters who didn't like either candidate. They weren't happy with their choices. And this is what, was referred to up to, I guess it still is, as the dual haters or double haters, the double negatives. People who didn't like Trump, didn't like Biden. Where were they going to go? And so he was getting a lot of these voters. There were some open questions about the extent to which those voters would, in the end, go into the polling place on election day. Generally, third-party candidates poll a lot better than they perform. It's generally been their history. So there was a fairly reasonable expectation that that would happen. But in the end, RFK Jr. was still positioned to play the spoiler in this race, and that more voters who traditionally would be thought of as Democratic voters were supporting him. More younger voters, more voters of color. And then you saw, and again, it emerged in this Ipsos poll. It's been duplicated elsewhere, and it's only seems to be picking up steam at this point. His numbers are just bottoming out, RFK Jr. He is doing worse and worse. In a lot of these polls, he's in the low single digits at this point. And I generally try not to prognosticate, but I would not be surprised at all if he, as you say, if he drops out and he accepts something with a promise for a potential second Trump administration. I think he was only staying in the race as long as he believed that he could help potentially throw the race to Donald Trump. We saw that recording of the phone conversation he had with Donald Trump, where it seemed to be suggesting a level of familiarity and support between the two that generally, in terms of what they were talking about, would be held between two opponents. We've seen other evidence of that since then. Obviously,
there was his campaign manager, of course. There was a leaked phone call there, or it wasn't a phone call. It was a small conference where she was explaining that the only reason he's running is to get Donald Trump elected. I mean, you can't get more explicit than that, Tom.
That's right. Well, you look at who they were targeting, where they were going. They were very much trying to peel off Democratic votes. The challenge for them is that RFK Jr. was unmasked far too early, right? Unmasked, I guess, being an appropriate term in multiple ways for him, given his COVID denialism. But as someone who's known as a vaccine denier and so on and so forth, and really putting that in the forefront. And frankly, I think how in the last couple of weeks that the Harris-Walz campaign is quite. I applaud them for this in terms of how well it's worked. They're really framing Republicans as just how weird they are. Well, RFK Jr. certainly aligned himself with Republicans. That story that came out last week about him in a roadkill bear that he placed in Central Park. He's perhaps even more weird than JD Vance, which is not easy.
Let's talk about this kind of notion of weirdness, because it's become very much the vernacular for Democrats to describe Donald Trump and JD Vance. And and I've been calling Trump weird for years, because I think it's a word that really does describe him quite accurately, even though he said out loud at his rally the other day, they call me weird. I don't think I'm weird. I was just like, this is great. How much is this weirdness propaganda, not propaganda, this weirdness use of language? How is it working or not working for the populace as a whole?
By all indicators, it's working incredibly well, because like we talked about, you saw this immediate bounce for the vice president when she ascended to the top of this ticket. And then you've seen this secondary bounce since then, which suggests people were initially excited. We know who she is. She's a younger candidate, a fresher face. Great. Some of those Democratic voters came home. But then the secondary element suggested people were seeing something that they hadn't seen before and they hadn't expected. And given that this was a theme of the campaign, you see this contrast. And I don't say this to be critical of the Biden campaign, because frankly, I agreed with the tactic they took, where they were running a campaign that was very much focused on the stakes. And I think it was a campaign they had to run, frankly. They had to say, yes, they can't deny that he was old. He was an older candidate, the oldest presidential candidate, would have been the oldest president. You can't deny that, but they say, but consider the stakes in terms of democracy, the future of democracy. And so it's a very somber message. And that was, again, the campaign that they had to run. And I thought it was the right approach. But you see this approach, which is much more just looking at them and laughing at them and saying, look, in a way, it's the fault that of all of us since Trump first came along, which was to normalize him and treat him as if he is a serious man who is capable of handling the serious job, perhaps the most serious job in the world. And for them to just belittle him in a lot of ways and tell the truth and saying, look, they're just weird. What it's saying is they are unserious. They're incapable. They are not up to the job. And it appears to be working. I think it's scratching an itch that perhaps we didn't realize was there.
And what about the phrase, not going back? We're not going back. Not going back to Donald Trump's presidency, not going back to a time where life was very difficult for people of color, for minority groups, for anybody that didn't kind of hit that gold standard for Donald Trump of being white and Republican and invariably male and Christian and having, racist views. And it occurred to me that really the Trump presidency was very much just giving people the license to be racist out loud. And that's why he connected with people, as we discussed earlier. But this not going back thing, I think it's very powerful. How has that chimed with you?
Yeah, I think it's perfect. Voting is aspirational in the end. It's hoping for a better tomorrow. And the campaigns that are most successful are the ones that are able to make that connection, to be seen as a vehicle for progress. Whatever that means, that will mean different things to different people. Whereas the Trump campaign has very much leaned into quite the opposite. The notion of make America great again. It's a notion that things used to be better. Let's go back there. And there is no doubt that there is a segment of Americans, as we discussed earlier, who hold that opinion. But a majority of Americans are aspirational, and they want to see this country move forward in any one of a number of ways. And so that slogan perfectly responds to this make America great notion. It perfectly reminds people of the 4 years of the Trump campaign, the Trump presidency, and why it would be bad news to go back there.
It's so important that we remember that time. I think that because he likes to rewrite history and lies about what inflation was doing when he was president and what jobs numbers were doing when he was president, how the economy was when he was president. Because there's so much propaganda associated with his legacy that I think it is hard for people to remember, especially those voters who are disengaged with it on a day-to-day basis. But ultimately, the legacy of Trumpism is this abortion ban, the overturning of Roe, and other things that we've seen the Supreme Court do, like giving Trump and presidents immunity, the Chevron case, which people haven't yet worked out, I don't think, how that will affect them on a day-to-day basis, effectively taking expertise out of these decisions that are made about things that we, come into contact with daily. Do you think that there is a difference between Trump's imaginary legacy and his actual legacy for some people?
No question. Yeah. And again, I not to pick it on the media relentlessly, but I think you're
welcome to here.
It's a safe place for that. I understand. They have to shoulder a lot of the blame because of these continued efforts to normalize him. Right. And, in the end, they're not talking about that legacy enough. And so they're allowing him to shape it and reshape it. And, given the benefit of time in the future, I'm confident he will be viewed for what he was and for what he actually did. And that will not be positive in the short term. Yes, there are these efforts to normalize him, and then he's able to go and rewrite history. He did it in his press conference last week, where he said that he had a bigger crowd than Martin Luther King
Jr. I mean, that in itself, it's, he was saying, they said he had 1 million and I had 25,000, but I know what it looked like, but I don't really care because I kind of liked him anyway. It's just so weird.
It is. It truly is. And it's yet another example of this sort of rewriting of history and telling people that what they saw with their own eyes wasn't real. And to your point, when you look at the actual agenda, when you look at the accomplishments, for the most part, they have been undoing progress. You think of taking the 50-year precedent of Roe v. Wade and then undoing it with the Dobbs decision, what he said is one of his proudest accomplishments. That's the true history and legacy of his presidency that I think will come into sharper focus as we get closer to election day.
Yes. The list, I think Seth Meyers did a very good list on one of his shows, where he was like listing all the terrible things that happened during Trump's presidency. And you thought it was over at the end of every sentence, and then there was another sentence. It is frightening how we forget even the little things, like the Sharpie extending the trajectory of the storm, that are so dangerous. And yet he was able to kind of get away with that. And I always say it's like he was pretending to be the president, like nothing really mattered. He could say anything, he could do anything, he could draw anything, and nothing really mattered because he has such a weird existence where he's, lived in his own bubble. But actually, there's 330 million people who these decisions affect.
Well, and I think he learned a lesson, which is an incredibly damaging lesson, because you've seen others try to echo it, which is, as long as you never admit that you're wrong and you never apologize, then they can't really get you on it. And, in the end, he's seen the consequences. That doesn't work in front of a court. And ideally, it won't work in the court of public opinion. But in terms of his presidency, the idea that he no longer cared about public opinion and consequence and would go forward with incredibly unpopular policies and then brag about them. I think it goes back to, he probably learned that lesson much earlier in life, but we think about the Access Hollywood tapes and the reaction to that, something that, again, to me is like a turning point in American politics, because when you think of the scandals that sank previous presidential candidates or candidates,
consensual sex between Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, for example, consenting adults, and yet that became an impeachment and perjury and everything that went with it, and yet Trump is lying daily.
Absolutely. And because of that, by just following one lie with another and just stubbornly refusing to admit that you're wrong about anything or apologize for anything, he actually found that it worked pretty well for him. And then you found that Republicans in general have now followed that since then, that you can only pay the price if you admit that you were wrong. And I think that's been incredibly damaging for this country.
But it's also destroyed the traditional GOP. And it means that, Trump, even though he thinks he's immortal and will live forever and can dodge bullets, he is not immortal. And so there will come a point when there's no Trump that might mean that there's no Republican Party as we know it either, right?
Well, and I think that's been on display this past year, right? Is there are a lot of Republicans who have been hungry to become the heir apparent to the MAGA throne. We saw that in the primary. And what we found is, and I hate to compliment Trump on anything, but it really isn't a compliment because it's a horrific crown to wear. But none of them are capable of pulling it off. Certainly J.D. Vance has proven just in the last few weeks that he is entirely incapable of being likable at the least or winning any sort of popular support. We saw that in the Republican primary, the entire field, again, doing their best impersonation of Donald Trump and failing miserably. So there isn't someone there. And so you're right. What he's done to the Republican Party, we talked about consecutive elections and in terms of them underperforming what historic precedent would have predicted in 2018, 2020, 2022, going into this election where statistically it should have been a layup. It should have been almost guaranteed that they would take back the Senate. And we don't know what will happen. It's an incredibly difficult map. But the fact that we're even talking about that, I think Democrats are actually in a reasonably and shockingly good position to hold on to the Senate. The only reason that Democrats were able to hold on to the Senate and keep the House close in 2022 was because Republicans ran candidates who saw themselves and molded themselves in the image of Donald Trump. And so as long as they continue to do that, they will continue to lose. And again, I think it would actually be better for this country if we had a healthier opposition party that actually was able to engage in discussions on policy. But as a political practitioner who works with Democratic candidates, I'm thankful that they continue to nominate candidates who are incapable of winning.
Yeah, it's so interesting. My money, and this is just a prediction, is that it'll be a dynasty. You'll get Donald Trump Jr. as the next leader of the MAGA Republicans, and in the same way that Lara Trump is now at the RNC, and just the idea of infiltrating the GOP with Trump. So maybe Barron will be a future candidate, who only knows. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about something you mentioned earlier, which is voter suppression, and also what happens if Trump doesn't win. That's next.
I've always found it difficult to find clothes that I like to wear, and when I find one thing that works, I just buy loads of them and just wear the same thing all the time. Well, men's closets were due for a radical reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter collection is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible set of products known to man. And here's why. Rhone helps you get ready for any occasion. The commuter collection offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, zips, and polos. You'll never have to worry about what to wear when you've got the Rhone commuter collection. The comfortable four-way stretch fabric provides breathability and flexibility that leaves you free to enjoy what life throws your way, from your commute to work or your 18 holes of golf. It's time to feel confident without the hassle. With Rhone's wrinkle release technology, wrinkles disappear as you stretch and wear the products. It's that easy. And with Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can ditch the dry cleaner altogether. I personally love a technical fabric, something that is advanced and uses technology to make a more comfortable and more modern outfit. Now, the commuter collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So head to Rhone.com/Anthony and use promo code Anthony to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/Anthony and use code Anthony, ANTHONY. It's time to find your corner office comfort.
We're back on the weekend show. I'm Anthony Davis. There has been talk that January 6, 2021 was the rehearsal for the next insurrection or coup or whatever you choose to call it. And there is the fear, and I've spoken widely about this recently, that Donald Trump, alongside the Heritage Foundation, are planning some kind of event that will make January 6th look like child's play. And that is potentially installing election deniers in legislatures. It is, them refusing to certify the election, trying to get it sent to the Supreme Court, and now the MAGA Supreme Court, who overturned Roe, gave Trump immunity, could potentially find the election in favor of Donald Trump, as was done in the year 2000 with George Bush. Slightly different circumstances, but still, it very much put that decision in the hands of the court. Have you been thinking about what will happen if Donald Trump loses, and the fact that he will absolutely not concede, claim it's fraud, and have a whole bunch of reasons why there needs to be a recount, or that he will claim that he's the president even though he isn't?
I have been thinking about this. It's frankly terrifying. I think one of the biggest reasons is because it is very plausible, because he's been effectively more than hinting at this. And you're right. The Heritage Foundation, the authors of the famous Project 2025, certainly seem to be positioning themselves for such an event. You mentioned installing election deniers in the state legislatures. Unfortunately, they're already installed in many of these states. You mentioned potentially not certifying election results. There are election deniers in county and state election boards who potentially certainly would face pressure to not certify election results, because they faced that same pressure last time around. I think what should make us more frightened this time than 4 years ago is that the quote adults in the room, the protectors of democracy, some of those people in the Trump administration who stood in the way, they're not there. They're not around the campaign. They've mostly been removed from the party. Obviously, from a federal government perspective, we're in a better situation in terms of the executive bureaucracy, but their ability when it comes to the certification of votes, which will happen initially at the state and local level, is limited. And to the extent that they could and certainly would litigate, you're right. In the end, it would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. And it's difficult to have much faith in the Supreme Court acting as a protector of democracy at this moment. So yeah, it's terrifying. And, this is something that would happen potentially in the immediate days after the election. January 6th obviously happened 2 months after the election, and you had that period where Trump attempted everything. This plan would likely be in motion much earlier. What can we do about it? The best thing we can do is make the margins unassailable, to win by a large enough margin that those who might have considered their ability to do this will hopefully think twice and think about prosecution. It's why what the Department of Justice has been doing, I know some people have been critical that they perhaps could have done more, but people are being prosecuted for this. People need to understand that if they do this, they could and would face federal prosecution, and hopefully that will be enough. But of course, what they will be counting on is that they would be installing Donald Trump, who would obviously protect them from any such prosecution.
What's different this time is that Trump is not the incumbent, so it's not going to be the same where last time he refused to leave the White House, didn't subscribe to the peaceful transfer of power, and we had all that mess to deal with, which was so crazy and so weird and so unconstitutional. It was a crisis. I know Americans they always talk about the threat. Oh, this could happen, this could, and I'm often coming in with my European perspective, and I'm like, it did happen. It's already happened. Democracy already fell. And if that image of the attack on the Capitol wasn't enough for you, what more do you need? But do you think that, because, Tom, he's not campaigning very much. He's not doing the rallies. He's not, he doesn't have the energy for it, partly age and other things, who only knows. But to me, it seems like he thinks that he's got it in the bag And that is not just based on the fact that he, has malignant narcissism. To me, it's because he's been reassured that there is a plan in place for him to win the election, no matter what the results are.
Yeah, to your point, in his press conference last week, he said that he likely wouldn't be campaigning much at all until after the Democratic convention.
Yeah.
And the idea of a presidential candidate just taking a few weeks off with less than 90 days to go until the election is bizarre. It does speak to either some level of confidence, as you say, which I think should be troubling, or something else happening. Like you say, yes, he is an older candidate. I don't think he has the energy to do it, but it's at such an extreme level now that it's troubling.
Kevin Roberts, who's the boss of Project 2025 now and the Heritage Foundation, I mean, we've clipped him talking about this plan. It's like the Democrats don't know what's coming. We have this plan in place. They're going to be really surprised. I mean, to me, that is the language of a coup. And as we know, it's not just about having Donald Trump win, but it's about changing America into a far-right Christian nationalist society where you pull down the institutions, even the FBI, the Justice Department, Department of Education, and you rebuild it in the image of this far-right version of Catholicism that Kevin Roberts and his ilk and Opus Dei and this weird kind of extremist church-going community have for America. The separation of church and state will be confined to history.
What concerns me the most about this is that those who are closest to or in the midst of Trump's inner circle are those who are making the most extreme and threatening comments, talking about retribution after the election when they win. That should be terrifying to every American.
But what can be done? You've mentioned that these election deniers are already in place. What can be done in this short term or in this period between now and the election, and certainly on election day and the day of the count, to kind of counteract this coup if it is indeed in place? I mean, who is representing us? Who is responsible for that? Who will save America literally from this idea of Trump installing himself and never leaving, a la Vladimir Putin?
I had a half serious answer to that come to mind, which is I don't know how many people know Mark Elias, but that was the first name that came to mind. Unfortunately, Mark Elias, the Democratic super lawyer, is people. He's the one who has been fighting in courts from the beginning against these Republican efforts, and he's incredibly good at it. The reality is, I look at this. Yes, from a legal perspective, we have better lawyers, and they have a better case to make. But if it gets in front of a partisan court like the Supreme Court, we're in trouble. In the end, as I said before, we have to organize. We have to register people to vote. They have to turn out in numbers that are so significant, that the margins are so significant that anyone who might have been considering this will look at it and say, we can't do that. And we have to hold our elected officials accountable now. You have to get them on the record, whether it's a state legislator, it's a county election official, certainly our members of Congress. Get them on the record that they will support the outcome of this election, period. And I know they will want to hedge on that. But the reality is, there are also a lot of Republicans who are looking at the disaster at the top of the ticket. They're looking at J.D. Vance and wondering if they can get rid of him. They are looking at the polling numbers shifting, and they are worried about themselves first. Because in the end, all of this is self-interest. All of it. It's about people looking for how they can hold on to power. And what we need to be able to make clear to them is that protecting democracy is not negotiable. And that has to be done before the election.
So let's talk to the alternative, which is this pairing of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. From your perspective, looking at polling and seeing how there has been a shift, Was Tim Walz the right choice for you? I mean, it feels that way, but from a polling perspective, can you see where the Democratic strategy is, and is it the right one?
Yeah, again, we're only a few weeks into this Harris campaign, but I have to give her and I have to give her team all the credit in the world, because it seems like they're doing everything right at this point. And again, it's weird for me to say as a pollster and an analyst, but they're not overreading the polls at this point. Meaning, similarly, we saw a lot of polls prior to the choice of Governor Walz as the vice presidential nominee. And they suggested that, again, maybe there wasn't much of a difference. So people thought about the electoral context and who can deliver what state. And that sort of math, you can twist yourself into pretzels. I think what they saw was someone who could be an inspirational leader, a complementary element to this ticket, and who could continue this momentum as someone who is just, when you think about that message that we were talking about, you think about not going back and someone who can continue to bring joy into this race. That's what he's done. He's just likable. I've seen that in my own household. My daughter, who's about to turn 18 years old and vote in her first presidential election, and was very excited to share some reels on Instagram of Tim Walz. And what her comment was that I'm so excited about this guy who I didn't know existed 24 hours earlier.
Yeah.
And I think that's how a lot of Americans feel at this moment, is the more they hear about them, the more they see there's something that just about everyone can relate to or connect with him. And so, I think he's the perfect choice.
There's talk of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz going into these swing states, these battleground states, places that Hillary Clinton failed to rally in. Strategically, the Electoral College, as you alluded to earlier, is rigged in favor of Republicans. It is, there's voter suppression going on in various states, whereas, in the rest of the world, civilized world, that they encourage everybody to vote. In Australia, it's mandatory to vote. That doesn't really happen here. And in fact, the more drop boxes you put, the more Republicans are like, well, that's fraudulent. It just doesn't make any sense, right? Voting should be everywhere. Do you think that they are making the right moves to be able to play the system to actually win the Electoral College? The popular vote is not even up for discussion, but the Electoral College is rigged in favor of Republicans. Can Democrats navigate the complexities of getting enough votes in those colleges?
I do think so. Even just from a tactical perspective, when you look at Tim Walz, obviously, we've talked plenty about the blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. People talk about the so-called white working class vote in those states. It's an incredibly important element of those states, but these states are also diverse. There's also the potential for young voters to play a significant role. We saw that in Pennsylvania with John Fetterman in his campaign in 2022, where he activated and energized young voters. Youth turnout was through the roof there. And we've seen what this Harris-Walz ticket is doing in terms of their appeal to younger voters. So, yeah, I think they're doing the right thing there. He has a record when he won in 2022 in Minnesota. Again, even in this context where historically and based on the past precedent, it should have been a very bad year for Democrats. Democratic turnout wasn't great in Minnesota in 2022, as it wasn't great anywhere. But he won relatively easily by appealing to moderate and independent voters and even Republican voters. And so the ability to do that in these states puts Republicans in a very difficult position. I think the other thing that we're seeing in this race, in this dynamic of what has changed in the last few weeks, is some states that President Biden won in 2020 that seemed to be falling off the table in terms of being winnable. Georgia was going in a bad direction. The so-called Sun Belt states, Arizona, Nevada, the polling showing those states coming right back into the fold. And so it makes it much harder for Republicans. Now, they were probably pretty excited about the idea of not having to spend a lot of resources in those states. And with this new ticket, with this new energy and enthusiasm, what you're seeing is much better polling. And in fact, some high quality polls showing the vice president pulling into the lead in those states. So the dynamic has shifted. So I do think they're being smart about this, not just from the context of the national vote, the popular vote, but especially in the context of the electoral college and how do you get to 270. What they've done is they've given themselves more than the one path, the one very narrow path that seemed to exist a month ago.
I like to remind people that the vice presidential role is one of the worst jobs because you can't upstage the president. And, invariably it's something that you have to just get on with in the background. Electioneering as a vice presidential candidate is different to being a vice president. And that's why I feel so much criticism has been pointed at Kamala Harris for her tenure as vice president, when invariably she was having to be the deciding vote in the Senate, amongst other things. But she's done so much. Now is her chance to talk about that and to shine, because Joe Biden isn't there and she doesn't have to be kind to his legacy. So do you think that people will realize now quite how valuable she has been, what she is capable of, and how that the presidency is actually entirely attainable for somebody of her talent and her ability, her experience, but also of, for her as a woman of color, it's monumental for American political history.
Absolutely. You're right. In the end, the vice president toils in at least some level of obscurity in that position. And to the extent that they are out there in public, oftentimes they're dealt a hand that's not the easiest one to win with. Republicans tried to attack her and likely will continue to, on the notion that the border and immigration was her portfolio. I think they've defended against that quite effectively. But what you're seeing, and I think President Biden deserves credit for this as well, and his team, is that they are shining a light on the important role that she played in a lot of the administration's successes. Are talking about the cap on insulin. Even just when you saw the freeing of the prisoners from Russia, yes. And that she was there and that she was a part of that as well. And so, yeah, I think there's a great opportunity in the last few months of this campaign to really lift up that role. And frankly, I think she's being viewed as more presidential. The fact that she is occupying the vice presidency in a more prominent way now, she's been more connected to these wins, to the extent that there is this historic nature of this candidacy, as you mentioned. I think for a lot of people, there's also that level of familiarity that she's already, there's not a question, can she do the job? Because really, in a lot of ways, she's doing significant components of the job already, which has, been the case historically. Great presidential, vice presidential duos who work together well. I don't think that was as apparent in the first few years of this presidency. Not to say it wasn't happening. It just wasn't something that they spent time talking about or promoting. And now you're seeing more of it. And I do think it's going to continue to benefit her over the home stretch of this campaign.
So it seems the message I'm getting from you is that it needs to be a landslide win for Kamala Harris in order for the election deniers to be silenced, and for that for this moment, this precipice choosing democracy over dictatorship, for that to be achieved, Trump needs to be trounced in the election.
I think there is the potential. Again, anything could happen in this race. I want to be clear, and Trump can still win. I think people need to internalize that is possible. There is a lot of time left in this cycle. There are a lot of people who want to manipulate this election in his favor. Nothing can be taken for granted. There is also the potential to win this race by very wide margins, and that hopefully will lead to a reckoning within the Republican Party. At a minimum, ideally, we would see the MAGA movement relegated to obscurity, and some sense of normalcy could return to this country.
Okay. We have to finish, but Tom Bonier, thank you for your expertise.
Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. See more of me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll be back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.